My mother handed me a Walmart sheet cake on my 16th birthday at 6:14 in the evening on a Wednesday in October. The cake had been the small rectangular kind that came in a clear plastic container with a snap-on lid. The cake had been white with blue icing roses. The icing had said Happy 16 Indira in small careless script. My mother had set the cake on the small kitchen counter. She had said, in the careful voice she had been using on me my whole life, "Indira, your father and I got you this for your birthday. We are going to be at your sister's planning meeting tonight, so you will need to eat dinner on your own. There are leftovers in the fridge." My sister Anjali had been turning 16 in 5 months. My parents had been planning her sweet 16 for the previous 14 months. The party had been scheduled for the following March at a small banquet hall outside our town. The estimated budget for the party, which I had overheard my mother discussing with my aunt on the phone the previous weekend, had been approximately $80,000. The budget had included a venue rental, a catered Indian dinner for 200 guests, a small live band, a photographer and videographer team, a custom dress, a small jewelry set, and a small candle lighting ceremony that my mother had been planning for almost a year. The Walmart cake had cost $12.97. I had been wrong about the price for years. I had finally seen the receipt 8 months later in the small drawer where my mother had been keeping miscellaneous papers. The receipt had been dated the day before my birthday. The cake had been the only item on the receipt. I want to tell you what happened 17 years later at my sister's engagement party at the country club outside our town, when my mother had stood up to introduce me to 240 guests as the one who was going to be paying for the party. I want to tell you what I said when I had taken the microphone from her. I want to tell you what my mother did with her champagne glass when I had finished speaking. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been the unfavored child for so long that they have stopped expecting anything from the people who have been favoring the other child for years, and who are about to be asked, by those same people, to fund the latest celebration of the favored one. I want to tell you what I figured out about what to say when the asking finally came. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about the cheapest gift your parents ever gave you on a birthday or holiday while spending lavishly on a sibling. Tell me what the gift was. Tell me how old you were. Tell me whether you said anything at the time or whether you just absorbed it. I read every comment. Now let me back up to the year I had been 12, because the year is when the spending differential had become impossible to ignore. My name is Indira Krishnamurthy. I am 33 years old. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a small software company in Austin, Texas. My company makes a specialized inventory management platform for mid-sized food distribution businesses. I started the company 5 years ago, with one engineer and $43,000 in personal savings. The company now employs 61 people. The company generated approximately $14 million in revenue this past year. The company has been acquired 3 months ago by a larger logistics software company in a transaction valued at approximately $112 million, of which my personal share, after the dilution from the small amount of venture capital we had raised in 2022, and from the equity I had granted to my early employees, has been approximately $38 million. My parents had found out about the acquisition through an article in our local business newspaper that had run 2 weeks after the deal had closed. They had not been involved in the company at any point. I had not asked them for investment when I had been starting it. I had not updated them on the company's progress during the 5 years of its growth. I had not invited them to the small celebration my team had thrown when the acquisition had closed. They had read about it in the newspaper, the same way the rest of our small town had read about it. My mother had called me the day the article had appeared. She had been crying. She had told me she had been proud of me. She had told me she had been wanting to celebrate with me. She had told me she had been hoping we could finally start having the kind of relationship we had not had for the previous 15 years. I had been polite on the call. I had not committed to anything specific. I had told her I had been busy with the transition work for the acquisition. I had told her I would call her back when things had settled down. I had not called her back. I had been hoping she would let the matter drop. I had been wrong. My mother had called me 3 weeks later. She had been calmer on the second call. She had been more specific. She had told me that my sister Anjali had recently become engaged to her boyfriend of 2 years, a man named Rohan, and that the family had been planning a small engagement party at the country club outside our town. She had told me the party was going to be large. She had told me the family had been excited. She had told me she had been wanting to know whether I had been willing to contribute to the cost of the party. I had asked her how much the party was going to cost. She had told me In the small, careful voice she had been using on me for the previous 3 weeks, that the budget had been approximately $65,000. I had asked her how much she had been hoping I would contribute. She had told me, after a small pause, that she had been hoping I would contribute the full amount. I want to tell you what I had been thinking about during the small pause that had followed her request, because the thinking had been the small clarifying work that had eventually led to the 3 words I had said at the party. I had been thinking about the Walmart cake. I had been thinking about every birthday from 12 to 17, when my parents had spent progressively more elaborate amounts on my sister's celebrations while giving me progressively smaller acknowledgments of my own. I had been thinking about my high school graduation, where my parents had not attended because my sister had been competing in a small regional dance competition on the same day. I had been thinking about my college acceptance, which my parents had been informed of by mail, and which they had never mentioned to me again. I had been thinking about my own engagement to my then-fiancé Drew in 2016, when I had been 25, which had been called off 6 months later, not because of anything Drew had done, but because Drew had finally been forced to acknowledge that his own family had been demanding a wedding budget my parents had been refusing to contribute to, even though they'd been simultaneously planning to spend 3 times that amount on whatever wedding my sister would eventually have. I had been thinking about all of this. I had also been thinking about the small, clear fact that my mother had been asking me, on the phone, to fund a celebration of the daughter she had been preferring over me for 33 years. At the moment in my life when I had finally accumulated enough money for her to be willing to ask me for it. I had told my mother I would think about it. I had then, over the following several weeks, done some thinking that my mother had not been expecting me to do. I want to tell you about my husband, Kai, because the husband is the part of the story that mattered most. Kai is 34. He is a small architect at a small firm in Austin. He had been my partner since I had been 28. We had been married for 3 years. Kai had been the steady, careful man who had been with me through the entire growth of my company. Kai had known the whole story of my family. Kai had been at the small celebrations of my company's small milestones over the years that my parents had not been at. Kai had been the person who had been holding my hand through the long acquisition negotiation that had ended 3 months earlier. Kai had also been the person who had, over the previous 5 years, been gently encouraging me to figure out what I had been wanting to do about my family, in my own time, on my own terms. I had told Kai about my mother's call that evening at our small kitchen table. I had told him what she had asked. I had told him what I had been thinking. Kai had been quiet for a long moment. He had then said, in the careful voice he had been using on me when I had been working through difficult decisions, "Indira, I am not going to tell you what to do about this. I will support whatever you decide. I do want to ask you something, though. I want you to think about whether you have actually decided what your relationship with your family is going to be for the rest of your life. I think you have been carrying the question in the background for the entire time I have known you. I think the question has been waiting for the moment when somebody in your family would do something that would force you to answer it. I think your mother has just done something that is forcing you to answer it. I think you should answer it. I think the answering, when you finally do it, is going to be the foundation of the next 30 years of your life. I think you should take your time with the answering. I think you should be honest. I think you should not let the answering be shaped by what your mother wants you to answer. I think the answering should be shaped by what you actually want for yourself." I had been quiet. I had then told Kai that I had been thinking about it. I had told him I had been thinking about going to the engagement party. I had told him I had been thinking about saying something at the party. I had told him I had been thinking about saying something that I had not yet figured out how to say. Kai had nodded. He had told me he would be with me at the party if I had wanted him to be. I had thought about it for the next several days. I had finally called my mother back on a Thursday evening. I had told her I would come to the engagement party. I had told her I would consider the funding question after I'd been able to see the party plans in more detail. I had asked her to send me the budget breakdown. My mother had been delighted. She had sent me the budget breakdown the next morning. The budget had been detailed. The budget had included $65,000 for the venue, the catering, the entertainment, the small floral arrangements, the photography, and the various other small line items that a $65,000 engagement party included. The budget had not been excessive by the standards of upper-middle-class engagement parties in our community. The budget had been the kind of budget that my parents had been planning to spend on my sister's celebrations for her entire life. I had reviewed the budget. I had not committed to funding it. I had simply asked my mother to confirm the date and the location of the party. She should confirmed both. The party would be at the country club outside our town on a Saturday evening in May. The party would begin at 6 o'clock with a small reception. The formal dinner and toasts would begin at 7:30. I had blocked the date on my calendar. Kai had blocked it on his. I want to tell you what happened at the party, because the party was the moment I had been preparing for. Kai and I had flown to my parents' town the morning of the party. We had stayed at a small hotel rather than at my parents' house. My mother had been disappointed by this. I had been firm about it. We had arrived at the country club at 5:50 in the afternoon. The country club had been a small upscale facility that I had visited a few times as a child. The reception had been held in the small ballroom on the second floor. My sister had been wearing a small red and gold lehenga that had clearly cost several $1,000s. My mother had been wearing a small green silk sari. My father had been wearing a small dark suit. My sister's fiancé Rohan had been wearing a small navy suit. The four of them had been receiving guests at the entrance to the ballroom. The 240 guests had been arriving steadily over the first hour. The guests had included most of my parents' extended family and friends, most of my sister's friends from college and her young professional network, and a small number of my parents' acquaintances from the country club and from the various community organizations they had been members of. I had been introduced to many of the guests as the protagonist of the local newspaper article about the acquisition. The introductions had been awkward. The guests had been smiling at me and congratulating me. The guests had clearly been told in advance that I would be funding the party. The not quite explicit suggestion of my role had been baked into the social atmosphere of the reception in a way that had been impossible to ignore. My mother had been moving through the room with a particular energy. My mother had been touching my arm frequently. My mother had been introducing me to people I had not seen in decades. My mother had been performing in the small, careful way she had been performing things at family events for 33 years, the kind of warm public closeness with me that she had never demonstrated in private. The dinner had begun at 7:30. The dinner had been served in a small dining room adjacent to the ballroom. The seating had been arranged at small round tables of 10 guests each. The family had been seated at the head table. Kai and I had been seated at the head table next to my sister and Rohan. The head table had been at the front of the room on a small raised platform. After the main course had been served, my mother had stood up. My mother had walked to the small podium at the side of the platform. My mother had picked up the small wireless microphone. The room had quieted in the careful way rooms quiet when the matriarch of a family is about to give a speech. My mother had begun. She had thanked everybody for coming. She had introduced Rohan's family, who had been seated at a small table near the head table. She had spoken about my sister, in the careful, affectionate voice she had been using about my sister since the day my sister had been born. She had talked about the small, specific qualities that had made my sister special. She had talked about how proud she and my father had been of the woman my sister had become. She had said this for about 6 minutes. The room had been listening. My mother had then said, in the small, specific way she had clearly been preparing for the moment, "Before I sit down, I want to take a moment to acknowledge somebody else. I want to acknowledge our older daughter, Indira. Many of you have read about Indira's recent business success in the local newspaper. We are very proud of her. We are also very grateful to her. Indira has been generous enough to fund this beautiful celebration tonight for her sister. We are so lucky to have a daughter who has been so successful and who is so willing to share her success with her family. Indira, please stand up so we can all thank you." The room had begun to clap. The clapping had been the polite anticipatory clapping that audiences offer when they have been instructed to thank somebody. I had not stood up immediately. I had been quiet for about 5 seconds. I had then stood up. I had walked to the small podium at the side of the platform. My mother had been smiling. My mother had handed me the microphone. My mother had stepped back to her seat at the head table. I had taken the microphone. I had looked out at the room. I had looked at my sister, who had been smiling at me with the careful smile she had been using on me at family events for years. I had looked at my mother, who had been still standing slightly behind her seat, waiting for me to finish whatever brief acknowledgement I was about to deliver. I had looked at my father, who had been looking at the table. I had said into the microphone in a clear voice that had carried to the back of the room, "I am not paying." The room had been silent for about 3 seconds. I had then continued, in the same clear voice, "I want to be transparent with everybody here tonight, because I think transparency is important, and because I think most of you have been told something that was not true. My mother has just thanked me publicly for funding this celebration. I am not funding this celebration. I was asked in a phone call several weeks ago to fund the entire $65,000 budget for this party. I told my mother I would think about it. I have thought about it. I am not going to pay. I have not communicated this to my mother before this moment. I have decided to communicate it publicly, in this room, because the public framing of my role tonight was created by my mother, and the public framing requires a public correction. The room had been completely silent. My sister had stopped smiling. My mother had been standing very still behind her chair. My father had been still looking at the table. I had continued. I want to explain briefly why I am not paying. When I was 16 years old, my parents bought me a $12 Walmart sheet cake for my birthday. At the same time, they were spending $80,000 planning my sister Anjali's Sweet 16 party. The discrepancy was not an accident. The discrepancy was the daily structure of how my family had been operating for as long as I could remember. I had been the daughter who had been told, in many different ways throughout my childhood, that I did not deserve to have money spent on me. I had been the daughter who had been treated as the inconvenient backup to the favored daughter. I had been the daughter who had been left out of my parents' attention, my parents' financial support, and my parents' celebrations for 30 years. I am now 33. I have built, on my own, without my parents' financial help, a small company that has just been acquired. The acquisition has resulted in my having a significant amount of money. My mother contacted me 3 weeks ago to ask me to fund this party. I want to be clear with everybody in this room. I am not going to be the daughter who funds the celebration of the daughter my parents have been preferring over me for 30 years. The money I have is not money my parents have any claim on. The money I have is the result of work my parents had nothing to do with. The money I have is going to be used for the things I and my husband decide it should be used for. The funding of this party is not one of those things. I had paused. The room had been still silent. I had said, I want to congratulate my sister on her engagement. I am sorry that I have chosen to deliver this information in this venue. I have chosen this venue because the framing of my role tonight was created in this venue. I have decided that I am not going to let the framing stand. The framing requires correction in the same venue in which it was created. I am going to leave the country club now. I am not asking my sister to apologize for anything. I am not asking my parents to apologize for anything. I am simply correcting the public record. The public record is corrected. Thank you for your time. I had said we could go down on the podium. I had walked back to the head table. I had picked up my small bag from the back of my chair. I had taken Kai's hand. The two of us had walked off the small platform. We had walked across the dining room. We had walked out of the dining room and through the ballroom and down the small staircase and through the small lobby of the country club and out to our small rental car in the parking lot. We had driven back to our hotel. We had checked out the following morning. We had flown home that afternoon. My mother had dropped her champagne glass at some point during my speech. I had heard the small sound of the glass hitting the small wooden floor next to the head table. I had not turned to look. I had been told later, by an aunt who had been at the party and who had eventually become one of my few continuing family contacts, that my mother had not been able to retrieve the glass. My mother had been standing very still behind her chair for the entire duration of my speech. My mother had then sat down. My mother had not stood up again for the rest of the evening. The party had continued without me. The party had been awkward. The guests had eventually left around 11 in the evening. My sister and Rohan had not spoken to my parents at the party after my speech. My sister had been quiet. Rohan had been polite. The two of them had been processing, in their own small way, what had happened in front of 240 guests. I want to tell you what has happened in the 8 months since. My mother has called me approximately 14 times. I have not answered. My mother has sent me a series of texts and emails. The texts have ranged from angry to performatively wounded to small careful attempts to negotiate. I have not responded to any of them. My father has not called me. My father has sent me one letter. The letter had been 3 pages long. The letter had been the small, clear summary of a man who had been sitting in the kitchen of his life for 33 years, watching what his wife had been doing to his older daughter, and who had not been able to push back against her at any of the moments when pushing back would have made a difference. The letter had been an apology. The letter had not made excuses. The letter had not asked for anything in return. The letter had ended with the sentence, Indira, I am not asking you to do anything. I am only asking you to know that I am sorry. I have been sorry for 30 years. I have not had the courage to say so. I am saying so now. I do not expect you to respond. I had not responded immediately. I had carried the letter in my small bag for several weeks. I had eventually responded with a small 2-paragraph email that had told him I had received the letter, that I had appreciated it, and that I would be open to a phone call when I was ready. The phone call had happened 3 months later. The call had been awkward. The call had been honest. We had been having one short call every 2 weeks since. My father had been doing the small, careful work of trying to be a different father at 68, which had been the work most parents are too set in their patterns to do. My father had been doing it anyway. I had been receiving the work. My sister Anjali had reached out about 4 months after the party. She had sent me a small handwritten letter. The letter had been short. The letter had said, in plain language, that she had been processing the events of the engagement party for the previous several months. She had told me she had been understanding things she had not been allowing herself to understand for 30 years. She had told me she had been ashamed. She had told me she had been wishing she had been a different kind of sister. She had told me she had been hoping I would consider seeing her, eventually, when I was ready. She had told me she had been getting married in October, regardless of what I decided, and that the wedding would be small, and that the wedding would be paid for by her and Rohan rather than by our parents, because she had decided that the kind of wedding she had been raised to expect was not the kind of wedding she had been wanting to have. I had been surprised by the letter. I had not been expecting Anjali to be capable of writing it. I had been quiet for several days after receiving it. I had eventually written her back. I had told her I had been hearing her. I had told her I was not yet ready to see her, but that I had been open to corresponding by letter for the foreseeable future. She had agreed. We had been writing each other small, careful letters about once a month since. The letters had been the most honest communication the two of us had ever had. Anjali and Rohan had been married in October. The wedding had been small. The wedding had been at a small park outside Austin, which Rohan's family had helped them organize. My parents had not attended. My parents had not been invited. Anjali had told me, in one of her letters, that she had been understanding, for the first time in her life, what it had felt like to make decisions about her own life without my mother's approval. She had told me the understanding had been hard. She had told me the understanding had also been the small, specific liberation she had not known she had been needing. I have not seen my parents since the engagement party. I do not know when I will. I am not in a hurry. I want to tell you what I have learned, because the learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past 8 months. The first thing I have learned is that the people in your family who have been treating you as financially undeserving for your entire childhood will, in the moment you finally have money, treat you as financially obligated to them in proportion to the money you have. The two framings are not in conflict. The two framings are the same framing. The framing has been that your money is not really yours. The framing has been that your money belongs to the family, and that the family will decide how the money is allocated, and that you will be expected to be grateful for the chance to allocate the money in the ways the family has decided. The framing operates whether you have no money or you have a lot of money. The framing is not about the money. The framing is about who has the authority to decide what happens to whatever you have. If you grew up in a family that decided you'd not deserve to have money spent on you, please understand that the family is going to continue to operate on the assumption that they have decision-making authority over your resources, regardless of how the resources actually arrived in your life. The decision-making authority was theirs when you had nothing. The decision-making authority will continue to be theirs, in their understanding, when you have something. The only way to end the decision-making authority is to end it. The ending of it is the small specific choice you have to make at some point in your adult life. The ending of it is not a transaction. The ending of it is a structural reorganization of who decides what about your life going forward. The structural reorganization is the work. The work cannot be done halfway. The work is the saying out loud that the decision-making authority has been transferred from your family to you. The saying out loud is the foundation of everything that follows. The second thing I have learned is that the public correction of a public framing is sometimes the most powerful tool available to you when somebody in your family has used a public venue to position you in a way you did not consent to. My mother had used the engagement party to position me in front of 240 guests as the funder of the celebration. The positioning had been done without my consent. The positioning had been designed to make it socially impossible for me to refuse to fund the party after the public announcement had been made. The positioning had been a trap. The trap had worked because the trap had been set in a venue where the social pressure to perform graciousness would normally outweigh the personal cost of correcting the record. The trap had not worked on me because I had been thinking about what to do with the trap for the previous several weeks, and because I had decided that the only proportional response to a public framing was a public correction in the same venue. The public correction had been hard. The public correction had been embarrassing to my family. The public correction had also been the small specific act that had broken the cycle of my mother's ability to position me in venues she controlled. After the correction, my mother had not been able to use any venue to position me ever again. The cycle had been broken. The breaking had been done in front of 240 witnesses. The witnesses had been the small specific protection that the public correction had built around the breaking. If somebody in your family is setting a public trap for you, please consider that the only proportional response is sometimes a public correction in the same venue. The correction will be embarrassing. The correction will be permanent. The correction will be remembered by everybody in the room for the rest of their lives. The remembering is the protection. The remembering is what makes the cycle impossible to restart. The remembering is the small, specific gift you give yourself in exchange for the embarrassment of the moment. The gift is worth the embarrassment. The gift is the rest of your life on different terms. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that the favored sibling, who has been benefiting from the family's distortions for decades, will sometimes, when finally confronted with the truth of the distortions, surprise you with the depth of their willingness to do their own work. My sister Anjali had been the favored daughter for 30 years. Anjali had benefited from every dollar my parents had spent on her celebrations instead of mine. Anjali had been the daughter my parents had been planning their lives around. Anjali had also been, when the truth had finally been said out loud in front of 240 guests at her own engagement party, the daughter who had been willing to look at what she had been participating in and to start the work of becoming somebody different. Anjali's wedding without our parents in attendance had been the small, specific evidence of the work. Anjali's monthly letters to me had been the other evidence. Anjali had been doing what most favored siblings are not willing to do, which had been to give up the favored status in order to have a real relationship with the unfavored sibling. The giving up of the favored status had been the cost. The real relationship had been the benefit. Anjali had decided, in her own time, that the benefit had been worth the cost. The deciding had not been my responsibility to bring about. The deciding had been Anjali's to make. Anjali had made it. If you have a favored sibling who you have been assuming is incapable of seeing what your family has been doing, please consider that the favored sibling may have been seeing more than you have given them credit for, and that they may, given the right moment, be willing to do work you have not been expecting them to do. The right moment is sometimes a public moment in front of 240 guests. The right moment is sometimes a quiet kitchen table moment after a phone call. The right moment cannot be manufactured. The right moment can, however, be recognized when it arrives, and the recognition is sometimes followed by the favored sibling's willingness to finally step out of the role they had been performing for decades. The stepping out is the small specific work that lets the two of you become real siblings to each other. The real siblinghood is the foundation of a relationship that the family had been preventing your whole lives. The foundation is real. The foundation is sometimes only laid after the family that prevented it has been functionally dismantled. The dismantling is hard. The dismantling is also sometimes the only thing that makes the real relationship possible. Both things are true at the same time. Carry both of them. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me, in the comments, about a moment when you publicly corrected a framing that somebody in your family had created without your consent. Tell me what the framing had been. Tell me what you said. Tell me who was in the room. Tell me what happened next. There are more of us than the families who built the framings would ever guess. We have been correcting the public record, slowly and carefully, in front of small specific audiences, for years. The correcting has been the foundation of every honest thing we have done since. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.